Hey, it's Trisha Mandis, and you are listening to Take Control Tuesdays, where you learn how to take control of your diet, your weight, and your health. Today, I'm so excited to share with you an amazing interview with an amazing guest. Today's guest holds a PhD in nutrition. She's a registered dietitian, and she's a personal inspiration to me, my life, and my work. She's an assistant professor in the Health Promotion, Education, and Behavior Department at the University of South Carolina. When it comes to understanding nutrition and the scientific evidence, she knows what she's talking about. Her personal research focuses on behavioral interventions for weight loss and the prevention and treatment of chronic disease. She also researches the use of emerging technologies for weight loss and health promotion. She's published over 90 papers in the scientific literature, including the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, Preventative Medicine, the American Journal of Medicine, and many more. She has a long list of honors and awards too. Just this year, she received the Early Cancer Investigator Award and the Early Career Mentorship Award from the Society of Behavioral Medicine. In 2012, the Obesity Society awarded her the Pat Simmons Award. She received the Society of Behavioral Medicine's Excellence in Research Award in 2007 and was recognized Young Dietitian of the Year Award in 2004. Who is this amazing woman? I'm asking many of your nutrition questions to today, Dr. Brie Turner-McGrievy. Dr. Brie, thank you so much for coming on Take Control Tuesdays.
Thanks for having me.
I'd like to start by telling our listeners how we met, one, because it's an awesome story, and it's also because how I ended up in South Carolina. Working on my master's thesis abroad, I was interviewing plant-based nutrition intervention studies, and I kept coming across your name in the literature. I read about 15 of your different studies, and I was like, who is this woman? I love her work. So I contacted you, and to my delight, the very next day you sent me an email saying you were just writing a job description for a project coordinator or nutritionist for a research study. And to make a long story short, here I am. So thank you so much for that, for bringing me to South Carolina. And I'd like to start by asking you if you can share with us some of the results from those intervention studies that I reviewed on my thesis, the comparison groups, the interventions, and the outcomes.
Sure. So it's very exciting when I hear that people are actually reading my research. So that was super exciting to hear. You think they just end up in journals somewhere and then they never get read. So it's nice to see that they ended in someone else's hands. Some of the things that I've worked on before in terms of research studies include a study looking at weight loss, a study looking at diabetes as an outcome, and then also infertility and polycystic ovary syndrome, and then also again looking at weight loss. So the first weight loss study I worked on was right after I got my master's degree, and it was at the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. It was right around the time when there were all these high protein diets coming out in popularity. So we wanted to test about a plant-based diet and looking at the impact of a plant-based diet on body weight. And we were able to track participants over the course of a 2-year period, randomizing postmenopausal women to either a plant-based vegan diet or a standard low-fat, low-cholesterol diet. And what we were able to show in one of the longest-term intervention studies for weight loss and plant-based diets is that even after we had not seen the women for a year, so 2 years after we started this study, the women in the vegan or vegetarian group or the vegan group lost significantly more weight or had maintained more of their weight loss than the low-fat, low-cholesterol group. So that was really exciting to see because that's really the holy grail, is looking at weight loss maintenance. Based on those results, we were able to get a grant from the National Institutes of Health that I was able to work on. And that study looked at diabetes. So we randomized participants to either follow a low-fat, low glycemic index, so trying to focus on carbohydrate quality as well, vegan diet compared to a American Diabetes Association diet approach. And again, we found improvements in the vegan diet group. They were able to improve their hemoglobin A1C and also improve body weight as well. So that was really exciting to see. All that research got me really excited about doing more research on my own, so I decided to go get my PhD. And after I did that, I took a job at the University of South Carolina in the Health Promotion, Education, and Behavior Department. And there I was able to do a study funded by the Vegetarian Nutrition Dietetic Practice Group of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, looking at the impact of a vegan diet for women with polycystic ovary syndrome who were trying to conceive. So, women with polycystic ovary syndrome tend to have difficulties with fertility, tend to have, usually are overweight. And so, we were looking at targeting achieving a healthy body weight and hopefully improving fertility. So, it was a 6 month study, and it was just a small pilot, but really looking at developing the intervention. And we looked at women following a vegan diet or a standard low calorie approach. And particularly by the 3 month mark, the vegan diet group had significantly greater weight loss than the low calorie group. And then after that, I did a study looking at 5 different diets, and diets that I consider sort of along the plant based diet spectrum. So going from vegan, vegetarian, to pesco vegetarian, to semi vegetarian, to omnivorous. So participants were randomized to one of those 5 diets, and we followed them over 6 months and looked at weight loss and some of the other outcomes related to that, such as dietary intake, and found that women in the vegan diet, or women and men in the vegan diet group, lost significantly more weight than the groups that had meat included in them.
Fantastic. So for our listeners, if you're not sure what a plant-based diet is, it's one that includes fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and legumes, which are beans, peas, and lentils. So how about other researchers' work, Dr. Brie? What are the benefits of a plant-based diet based on the scientific literature?
So some of the studies that I'm really always been interested in following are those from very large cohorts. So one of them is the Seventh-day Adventist cohort, and that cohort includes people who are Seventh-day Adventist, and about half are vegetarian, and a portion of those are vegan. And it's a really nice group to be able to look at different types of plant-based diets and all different health outcomes. So it's a unique group too because they tend not to smoke or drink, so it sort of controls for those natural health confounders that we see in some other studies. And they've looked at a lot of different outcomes. They've looked at metabolic syndrome and found that vegetarians tend to have better metabolic syndrome, or less metabolic syndrome, which means they have better HDL, lower triglycerides, better glucose, better blood pressure, lower waist circumference. And then they've also looked at things like diabetes, body mass index, and found that as you go from vegan to vegetarian to pesco vegetarian to semi-vegetarian to omnivore, rates of BMI go up, prevalence goes up of diabetes as well. And then there's also the EPIC cohort, which is out of Europe, which has looked at these different plant-based profiles as well and found that those following more plant-based diets tend to have lower blood pressure, less cardiovascular disease, less cancer, and also tend to gain less weight over the course of a 5 to 10 year period.
This question comes from a Take Control Tuesday viewer, and they want to know if you can recommend a good vegetarian diet for almost menopausal women. Can you, and what evidence is there to support your answer?
So diet can have a pretty powerful effect on some of our health-related outcomes that are associated with going through menopause. For example, experiencing hot flashes. So there was a study that looked at over 6,000 women, and those women were going through menopause, and they looked at the frequency of hot flashes and then also looked at the type of diet they were consuming. And they found that those who were consuming more plant-based diets, so diets similar to, say, Mediterranean style, where there's lots of grains, vegetables, legumes, and then also diets that had a lot of fruit in them but were plant-based, tended to have fewer hot flashes than those who were consuming diets that were very high in fat, high in sugar. So there's some evidence that diet can be protective against hot flashes, for example. But the study that we did with postmenopausal women on a vegan diet, we found that they were able to lose weight. In fact, almost twice as much weight as the low-fat diet group. And why that's important is women tend to tell me as they're going through menopause that weight loss tends to be very difficult. They tend to gain weight for no reason at all, and it's harder to lose. So we found that a plant-based diet may be a really nice way to potentially relieve some of the symptoms of menopause, but also help with some of the weight gain that tends to occur.
I asked my email list what number one question they'd like me to ask you, and their answer: how do I get enough protein eating a plant-based diet? Should our listeners, Dr. Brie, be concerned about protein?
So the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics has a position paper on vegetarian diets, and one of the statements they have around protein says that plant protein can meet protein requirements when a variety of plant foods is consumed and energy needs are met. So basically, if you're eating a varied diet of plants and you're eating enough calories, which you should as long as you're not hungry, you're going to be meeting your protein needs. It also goes on to say that research indicates that an assortment of plant foods eaten over the course of a day can provide all essential amino acids and ensure adequate nitrogen retention and use in healthy adults. So you don't need to combine proteins. That's a myth that's been out there, and it's just not necessary. It also is said that typical protein intakes of lacto-ovo vegetarians and of vegans appear to meet and exceed requirements. So research has shown there's really not evidence of protein deficiency among those following plant-based diets.
One viewer wrote in and said, when I tried to eat a vegan diet before, I wasn't getting enough protein and I'd get shaky. In the last 2 weeks, I've had personally one middle-aged woman and 1 to 2 high school girls tell me that they get hungry and angry if they don't eat enough animal products. What are your thoughts to these comments?
So protein deficiency is a pretty serious condition, but usually hangriness isn't one of the side effects of it, nor is like shakiness. So that's more like brittle nails, hair falling out. And protein deficiency is actually very, very rare in the United States. It's pretty hard to be protein deficient. And in all our studies that we've done, we've never had a participant get protein deficient. So generally, if someone is making a diet change and they're feeling shaky or hangry, it's probably a result of something other than protein. My guess is they may not be eating enough calories. That often happens if you change diets and you don't know what to eat, so you kind of drop off on how much you're eating anyway. You may be switching to eating too much refined sugar, or you may be not eating enough fiber or satiating foods in the diet that are going to keep you full for a longer period of time.
What if we have a middle-aged woman, for example, and she does an intense workout 5 to 6 times a week for an hour a day, vigorous activity? Is there any reason to be concerned about getting enough protein in this situation?
So our current protein guidelines of zero point 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight are for people who are doing moderate to vigorous physical activity. We're hoping that everyone's going to be doing that. That's why the protein amounts are set for that. Very strenuous or prolonged endurance activity may result in higher protein needs, and that's just because you get these microscopic tears in your muscles, and so protein's needed to repair them. But even if you're doing our recommended or even above recommended, generally your protein needs are going to be met. You may deplete your protein amounts in the diet if you're not doing enough glycogen. If you're doing endurance activities, you may deplete your muscle glycogen, which is your source of carbohydrate. And so you may go to protein in your body after that. But generally, that's not going to happen. But you may, some sources say that up to 1.7 grams per kilogram per day if you're like an elite bodybuilder or doing very intense endurance activities like Ironman triathlon kind of levels. But even at that level, it's pretty easy to meet on a plant-based diet. So let's say you're a 175-pound individual, and that's about 80 kilograms of body weight, which translates into needing 143 grams of protein each day. So that means you could have some scrambled tofu and tempeh bacon for breakfast. You could have lentil soup and a peanut butter sandwich for lunch, snack on some edamame for a snack, and then dinner have a quinoa, spinach, and bean salad with a veggie burger. So that's sort of a typical what a lot of people would eat anyway. You're particularly going to be eating all the time if you're doing that amount of endurance activity. So meeting protein needs are usually not that difficult, even if you're doing a lot of physical activity.
Dr. Brie, what does the research say about vegan diets and deficiencies compared to those eating the standard American diet? And how do scientists collect this information?
So from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics position paper, again, they outline the key nutrients that may be lower in a plant-based diet. So the one that's really of concern is vitamin B12. So that's you can't get that on a whole food plant-based diet unless you're consuming foods that are fortified. And a lot of our participants in our studies when we look at what they're eating, we do what's called a 24-hour dietary recall. We'll do a couple of those. They're unannounced. They don't know when we're going to do them. And then we analyze the content of their diet. And we find that they're still meeting vitamin B12 even without taking any supplements into account. And that's because things like cereal, soy milk, rice milk, coconut milk, those are all fortified with B12. So a lot of times people are meeting those needs anyway. But we still tell people usually to find a source of B12, either a supplement B12 or a multivitamin will meet their needs throughout the day. Other nutrients of concern that tend to be slightly lower, omega-3s, so that tends to be in nuts and seeds, so we always encourage people to have those. Zinc can be lower on a plant-based diet, but it's really hard to detect deficiency or measure deficiency, so there aren't a lot of studies that have shown any deficiencies. Iodine may be lower, and that's because iodine is used to clean udders of cows. That's how they disinfect them when they milk them, and that iodine then goes into the milk, so milk tends to be a source of iodine. And so if you're not having milk, then you're not getting that iodine. So just doing iodized salt, the supplement again, a multivitamin would cover you. Calcium tends to be lower in plant-based diets, but in our studies, again, we see that everyone's consuming low calcium. It's just really hard to meet that 1,000 milligrams, and that's our general RDA here, our recommended dietary allowance. And so if you look at other countries, generally their recommendations for calcium are much lower. So in a lot of the studies that have looked at plant-based diets and osteoporosis and looked at dairy intake and whether or not that protects against osteoporosis, you just don't really see a clear benefit. And then vitamin D, lastly, can be lower on plant-based diets. So we just tell people get out in the sun. 10 minutes is all you need, and that tends to provide vitamin D. And again, that's usually in fortified soy milks and rice milks and coconut milk and that kind of thing.
Is there a difference between levels of saturated fat, cholesterol, or fiber when you compare people eating the standard American diet and plant-based diets?
So in our most recent study where we looked at the 5 different diets, the vegan diet group was the only one that met saturated fat recommendations, so keeping their saturated fat below 10%. So even vegetarian, pesco-vegetarian, were not meeting saturated fat recommendations. So it's always interesting when you see saturated fat recommendations come out from, say, the U.S. dietary guidelines, and you just wonder, well, how can that really be met when even we've been testing it in these different dietary approaches? Really, the plant-based diet group is the only one that's able to meet that requirement. So we see much lower saturated fat levels, much lower cholesterol intake, and then also much higher fiber as well. And again, when we look at who's meeting our fiber recommendations, it's also hard to meet fiber recommendations if you're not eating an entirely plant-based diet.
When you eat a plant-based diet, do you have to, and in these studies that you talked about, do you have to restrict how much you eat or count calories?
So we don't ever do that with our plant-based studies, and that's what's so exciting about them is no one has to track what they eat. We give them guidelines. We tell them to stick with avoiding refined plant foods, doing the whole plant foods, limiting added fats, and then you can just eat whatever you want, which is really, really exciting. And in our studies where we've measured what's called dietary restraint, we use the 3-factor eating questionnaire. In our weight loss study that we did, looking at a low-fat, low-cholesterol diet versus a plant-based diet, it was really interesting because you would think that the plant-based group would have an increase in their dietary restraint. So that means how constrained you feel when you eat. If you're going out to a restaurant, do you feel like you have to look over the menu a bunch? And do you have to measure out portions and those kind of things? And we found that the plant-based group, their dietary restraint went down. So they felt less restrained or constrained when they were eating, whereas the low-fat group, their restraint went up because they're having to, only eat a size of meat that's the palm of their hand and only eat 60 grams of fat per day. And so they felt more constrained on the diet.
How can people learn more about your work? People may be interested in participating in one of your research studies, and I know there's many students at USC who'd love to work with you on a plant-based project. How can we stay connected with you?
So people can always go to my website. It's www.brie.net. So it's brie.net. And I have a participate link there where people can go and sign up for studies if they're advertised there. And if we don't have any studies at that moment, you can always join our registry and we'll contact you. So if you're in the Columbia, South Carolina area and interested in participating in those kind of studies, it's a great resource for you to check out. And then if you're interested in getting your master's degree or a PhD, I'm always looking for great graduate students to come work with me as well on plant-based diet studies.
Awesome. And I'll be sure to have Dr. Brie's website on the blog too. So go to trishamandis.com. If you missed that, you'll find it there. All right, Dr. Brie, our final question. What's the number one diet change you'd recommend people make to improve their health?
So, because I'm in the Department of Health Behavior here, we always think about how we can make health behavior easier and more achievable. And one of the things I tell people is to focus on the short term. So, I tell people try a plant based diet for 3 weeks. And that gives you enough time to have your taste buds change a little bit, find some new recipes, get out of that awkward 1 to 2 week first stage, really get a hang of it. But it's also not so long term that it seems like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to do this forever. And then you do it for 3 weeks, and then maybe you say, oh, I feel pretty good. I'm going to do it another 3 weeks. So it allows you to focus on more of the short term than some unachievable long term.
Is it also possible for people to possibly get results within 3 weeks? And if so, what would they be?
Yeah, we've seen people see changes pretty quickly in 3 weeks. So, on just sort of an individual level, people may find out that they're not lactose intolerant anymore when they cut out, or they were lactose intolerant when they cut out dairy. So they find that we've had participants say, I thought I was just gassy all the time, but it turns out it was really the dairy that was causing it. Heartburn can go away. So sometimes people, when they cut out a lot of the animal foods, soda, those kind of things, they can see improvements in their heartburn. And then weight loss, that's sort of an immediate thing that you can see that's really motivating. And then if you happen to be at the doctor's and you're getting lab results, you can see changes in things like blood pressure, even blood glucose, lipids, those kind of things fairly rapidly.
Now, Dr. Brie and I would love to hear from you. Please answer today's Take Control Now question in the comments below. We want to know this about you. What's the hardest part about eating a more plant-centered diet or a healthier diet in general? What challenges do you face sticking with it for the long term? Dr. Brie has also shared one of her favorite recipes with us today. It's on the blog, spicy black beans and tomatoes. I also want to challenge you to give Dr. Brie's 3-week challenge a try. Give yourself a week to prepare, get ready, get your groceries, go for it, and then report back and let us know how it goes. Once you've answered, I want you to forward this interview to one specific person who you think would really like to hear it. And then if you haven't already, be sure to sign up for email updates on my website, trishamandis.com. And when you do, you get a free nutrition resource guide sent directly to your email inbox. Get educated, get support, and take control. Yes, you can get the healthy body you deserve.